Welcome back for part 2 of this jolly lark where we're speed painting on top of a blue and white undercoat. In this video we're going to see how far we can push the results with a few different layers. You can decide when the right time to stop is for you and your army project, but we're going to take it all the way as we would for one of ours. Alright, so with the blue and white layers fully dry, I'm going to show you how this works with 3 different colors here. We've got some DARKOATH Flesh, got some Militarum contrast Militarum green, and the contrast Aggros dunes. So I'm going to see what sort of effect this has, putting it over this white and blue layer here. So with the flesh, what we're going to do is you're not putting this on in one thick coat. You're putting this on in one thin coat. You can go over it again if you want the color to be more pronounced, but you'll see what sort of effect we're getting quickly here. On the skin, the white and gray highlights are effectively becoming the flesh highlights, and the blue is getting tinted by the Guilliman flesh color, the DARKOATH flesh, and is turning into a really nice shadow color. You want to put the contrast paints on reasonably carefully at this stage. Don't slop it around too much because you want to preserve the different areas of color. You can see that was really fast to get a pretty solid result. And what you're looking to do is kind of bring the contrast paint all the way in so it's covering up all the blue. You're not looking for blue lines around your colors. And there you've got pretty quickly, pretty good looking, well shaded face without a whole lot of effort. So let's show you on another color here. Actually, let's do, we'll do one more bit of skin here. We'll do the hands too, because those are also going to be important and easy to see. So on the hands, just kind of going in. I like to use a decent sized brush that has an okay tip for this, but you know, enough to hold some contrast paints in there. Getting in the cracks. We'll leave the fingernail white for right now, because we're going to go back in and put another color on that later. This is Hrothgorn from the Warhammer Underworld set, part of a Warcry Ogre warband I'm working on. Stay tuned for a painting video on Black Powder Buccaneer. There you go. Again, that's a pretty good looking hand. It's reasonably well shaded for not tons and tons of effort. This is not going to win you a Golden Demon, but it's a great way to get your miniatures painted and on the table fast, and that's what we're here for. All right, I'll show you another color real quick with the Militarum green. I think we're going to use that for his pants here, just to see how the blue undercoat interacts with a different color. So with his knee that's sticking out here, we're going for one thin coat. We don't want the contrast paints puddling up here. We're looking for a thin, even coat. Note how the paint is only just on the tip of my brush here. Wipe it off I use my thumb. You wipe it off on a paper towel if you need to. And again, what you're getting here is you're tinting the blue with a little bit of green. You're tinting the highlights green, and ending up with something that's, I think, a more realistic, better looking shade effect than if you had just used the Militarum green alone over a white undercoat. And unlike some of the super fast painting methods using black and white, you do want to go in and paint all the areas the correct colors. So for example, his little patch of pants that's under here, you still want to go in and hit that with some of the green. You don't just leave it black, because then what you're actually doing is leaving it blue. But compare those two knee areas. That one looks much darker than that one, which is exactly what you want. And you've achieved that with the same thin layer of green with just a different undercoat. All right, with the flesh and the green finished up, I'm gonna go in with some AGRAX dunes, which are a really nice kind of slightly yellowy brown color, and put that on some of the different leather sections. And now you can see even with this lighter, little mistake here, no problem. Contrast paint cleans up well with water. Use water to get it out of the recesses, and then use your fingertip to get it off the surfaces. So with AGRAX Dunes, it's a thin, a yellowish brown. It's my go-to for leather, even though there is a paint in the contrast range called Snakebite Leather. I prefer the Aggros Dunes usually. Again, nice thin coat. The nice thing is about doing one thin coat, it's kind of hard to do it wrong. You can see when there's too much paint on it, like right there. And just wipe it off with your brush. Another reason you don't want to put too much paint on your brush is you want there to be space in your brush to pull up any extra paint. If your brush is already saturated with paint, like look at this area here, you can't pull it up with your brush. Your brush is a little bit like a sponge. At this point, the exact colors don't matter. I'm going to work my way around the miniature, putting one thin coat of contrast paints on all of the areas. I'm going to use the same Black Templar black for both any areas I want to be black and also any areas that I want to be metal. Go in with a little bit of red. You know, all the colors work on top of this. Paint the guts in his bag with a little bit of red, like so. You can even take a little bit of watered down red contrast and kind of paint it on the bottom of the bag, like a little bit of the bloody guts that he's collecting have soaked through the leather of the bag. Blech. Quick wash of whatever you want on the base that matches the rest of your army project. This is the Pro-Acryl Dark Umber. And then we're going to come in and just put a little bit of the Pro-Acryl White Gold onto all of the metal areas that we previously painted black. For the metal, you do want those black shadows. If you had left the metal areas blue, that blue isn't going to look like a natural shadow for a shiny, reflective metal. Going on pretty heavy here. These are going to get another little wash of something later. So it's kind of a wet brush. It's not quite a dry brush, but just, you know, keep it controlled. Keep the metal on the metal areas. You don't want to get any metal on the areas that you've previously colored. You know, as I was editing this video, I'm trying to keep it at a reasonably quick pace, and sometimes, like here, you know, it really does look like a lot more work has been put into this miniature than it actually was. It's not super interesting to watch put, you know, one light coat of color on a thing, but you just get results very, very quickly. Every single area on this miniature right now, as I'm working on the metal, all the other areas of the miniature have only had one thin coat of a contrast paint. What color doesn't really matter. Some of the thicker paints you might want to mix with a little bit of medium if they go on too heavy so that you can't see the blue underneath, but it really is that easy. For this next step, we're going to boost the shadows just a little bit in the deepest, darkest crevices. You could do this even before putting the color on with a Nuln Oil gloss wash over the whole thing. Really 6 of one, half dozen of the other, whichever you prefer. I like the look of the transparent black, and it's pretty quick and easy to do, and kind of it's a little more controlled. It doesn't get everywhere in this way that a Nuln Oil wash does. But if you've watched any of the Borderlands videos, most of those start with a Nuln Oil gloss wash over the whole miniature to create these sharp distinctions between color areas. That works great. It's a little bit easier. It's a little bit faster if speed is your primary concern. But I'm trying to strike a balance between speed and tabletop quality here. With the transparent black, you're just rubbing a little bit into the cracks and crevices, wiping any excess off your brush, and then using that mostly empty brush to kind of smear it around and feather it out on the miniature. It's pretty quick process. If you haven't done this before, it might take a couple miniatures to get the hang of, but you just smush a little bit of the pure transparent black into the cracks and crevices, and then with a mostly empty brush, kind of wipe it off, smear it around. And you can just keep going with this until you're happy with the level of shadows that you've got on your miniature. That could be even darker, more shadowed than I've got here. It could be none at all. That'd be fine too. However much shadows you put on, even just with the blue and white starting point, you're going to have a good looking miniature. So with that, we've got a miniature that's pretty much ready for the table. This is a solid looking miniature. It's going to look great from tabletop distances. I think Hrothgorn here could be ready to go. So I grabbed Hrothgorn, threw him in the light box to give him the finished mini turnaround treatment. But we're going to pick him back up and take it a little bit further. For the next stage, we're going to grab some Pro-Acryl Bright Ivory. And this is really the fastest of any of the boosts you could give a very basic contrast paint job. With the Pro-Acryl Bright Ivy and a big fat dry brush, we're going to just give the whole model a very, a light dry brush all over the model to pick up some of the raised areas. If you watched part 1, that was about preparing the model for speed painting, this stage is comparable to the white dry brush in part 1. It's a pretty light dry brush. It's only on the upper raised areas of the model. And this is my favorite part of painting the miniature. When you're doing this stage, you're really just watching all the detail on the miniature come alive. This is grabbing all those edges. It's grabbing the detail, the tips of his nose, his eyebrows, the folds of the leather. And after this, the model's really going to pop on the tabletop. Start to finish, including the time to prepare it with the blue and white undercoat, to get a model finished with this step, probably you could get done in, somewhere in the 20-25 minute range. That's the best estimate because when I'm filming these videos, I'm going a little bit slower so that you can see what's going on. I'm not worrying about hitting the metal areas here. It's fine if you get a little bit of a bright ivory highlight on the edges of the metal. I think that looks just fine. This is just kind of all over. Pick and choose where you want a little bit brighter light to fall and just kind of keep going with that till you're happy. You can see I'm hitting the chains there. This does wash out the miniature just a little bit because you're putting that ivory highlight all over everything. It can have the effect of desaturating the miniature a little bit. Depending on what you're going for, that might be exactly what you want. And if not, keep watching, and we're going to add back in a little bit more color to deepen the color of the highlights and darken the color of the shadows just a little bit. This is the second time I'll say it in this video, but you could call it done at this point. Again, it's up to you how long you want to spend on each model. I think this mini looks great. I'd be totally happy to play games with it. Here it is in the Lightbox turnaround, as you might present a finished model with good lighting. This looks great. For a basic troop, you're good to go. This is a totally good looking miniature. Look, here's how it compares to the starting point, to the first stage. I think that's a big improvement. But since Hrothgorn is a character, I love the model, let's take this one even a little further still. So I think it's interesting to point out, having seen this miniature inside a light box with, good directional lighting, and then seeing the exact same miniature under the harsh bright lights, the 500 watts worth of light that I use for painting, the 500 watts of light that my middle-aged eyes need to see all the detail, the miniature looks a lot worse under that harsh flat lighting, which is great for painting, than it does when you've set the miniature up in a light box and tried to photograph it in the most flattering way. Just something to keep in mind when you're evaluating your own paint jobs. Don't be too hard on yourself. The miniatures you're seeing online, mine included, they may look better on Instagram than they do in your hand or in person. So for this stage, what we're doing here, and what I've been doing as I was talking about miniature photography, is just using a fine brush to add a little detail with the Pro-Acryl Bright Ivory to the miniature. That can be in the form, depending on the model, that can be little scratches and scrapes in the leather. I painted a little crosshatch pattern on his knee to give the impression of, a little bit of a rough pattern or a rough weave in the fabric, hitting the bridge of the nose and the ridges above the eyes. You can dot the eyes with a little bit of white at this stage, painting in the highlights on the skulls. And this is just like the transparent black earlier did. This is just boosting the contrast and the texture just a little bit with some little dots and dashes and edge highlights. I'm also going to grab a little bit of foam sponge and use that foam sponge without a whole lot of paint on it to dab on a little bit of texture. A little bit of sponge painting is a nice trick, especially for leather. Might do a longer video on leather later to add a little bit of texture to a flat swath of leather. Pretty quickly. You could do this by hand, but using the sponge is a lot faster and I think gives similar results. And when you're trying to clear out your pile of gray, doing something a little faster, so much the better. So at this stage, just move the model around in front of your eyes, see what areas maybe feel like they could be a touch brighter. You generally want to focus on upward facing edges and surfaces, corners of the caps, again, painting in a little bit of a crosshatched fabric weave on the green there. Because we're adding the Pro Ivory all over, it is going to further desaturate the miniature, but that's okay. Because what we're doing now is going back to those same colors that we used in stage 1 and putting on a second thin coat of contrast paints over the highlights that we just applied. Depending on what color you're using, depending on how thick or thin it is, you may want to thin it down with a little bit of medium. It'll take a little bit of practice with the contrast paints to figure out which paints need a little bit of thinning and which ones don't. The Militarum green that I'm using here doesn't. It's a relatively thin color. Colors like Gorgonta Fir and Wildwood are very dark. I'll often with something like Wildwood, if I was using that for this technique, I'd be using it probably 1 part paint to 3 parts medium. So you're just going around the miniature, a little bit Aggros dunes on the bones, and putting back on the same contrast colors that you chose before. Maybe thin down a little bit, and those are going to be covering up those lighter highlights and textures that you just put on, and kind of tying it all together. As a final step here, I'm going to grab some AGRAX EARTHSHADE, one of Citadel's thin shade paints. They're much thinner than the contrasts. I'm going to use this just for a bit of weathering. This isn't really shading, but just a bit of weathering. Put some AGRAX EARTHSHADE, because this is a dirty, grimy ogre, a little bit of this brown wash on the metals, on the skulls, splash a little around on the wood. You can see on this metal bracer here, adding a little bit of AGRAX EARTHSHADE just kind of gives it a bit of tarnish and rust and grime that the pure silver over black wouldn't otherwise have. This is quick and messy. Just kind of dab it on any which way here, because you're not trying to shade with this. This is just serving as a little bit of weathering on the model to make it look like the dirty ogre that Hrothgorn is. So once we're done with that, we're going to grab a couple of other colors and add the little bits of detail that a character model deserves. First up is some CARROBURG Crimson. This is another one of Citadel's thin washes, not one of the contrast paints. It's a great accent color for areas of inflamed or reddened flesh. We're just going to put a little bit of the CARROBURG Crimson onto Hrothgorn's nose to give him kind of the maybe half-drunken, cold look. Put a couple little splashes of that onto the cuts on his arm. Give a quick wash of the crimson shade into the meat of his bag, and some of the guts that are spilling out there will re-accentuate with this thin shade, the soaked through bottom of the bag. Again, blech. But I think it's a neat effect of the blood soaking through the leather. A little more earth shade on any metals that look good. It's almost there. We're about 35-40 minutes into painting at this point, and we're about to call it done. We're going to grab a little bit more of the metal and a fine brush and just put a couple dots on any bits of metal that got overpainted in previous steps. For Hrothgorn, it's all the little studs on his leather straps, the bolts and screws on his crossbow. This can also serve as a brief highlight on any of the chains or other metal areas. Kind of going back in. While you got your palette out, you can always put on a little more bright ivory onto any raised areas at this point that you want, or as appropriate, some extra little scratches and dings on the leather, but this is very light, tiny little spot highlights. I wouldn't even call these edge highlights, just a little teeny bit here and there. Now, if you're watching this and thinking, all right, Stage 1, cool. Stage 2, I thought it looked good. There's no way I'm painting the weave of a fabric, onto his knee. That's fine. All of the steps in this stage here, you can 100% leave out. Do the ones you feel comfortable with. Do the ones that you feel like are necessary. Maybe you want to paint that little bone that's in his hat, but you don't want to paint the wood grain on the top of his crossbow here. Totally fine. It's up to you where you decide to leave your miniature. The goal with this video series is to show you that there's a lot of different places you can take your miniature. There's not one right way to go. There's no such thing as enough. You can always do more, and often you can do less. And less is sometimes fine if what you're trying to do is get 40 models ready for a tournament next weekend. So Little out of focus here, apologies for that, but you can see I'm just kind of dotting on tiny little specks of bright ivory to help draw the eye to some of the most raised details. And kind of like that, like so. Looks good. Stick some static grass tufts. These are from Tajima 1, as I've used in many of my other videos. To match your basing schemes, I'm going to use a couple of yellow ones and maybe a green one to pull in the colors from the yellows and greens that are on Hrothgorn here, and honestly to match the rest of my ogre army. Putting on the static grass tufts gave the washes time to dry, so I'm going to grab some bright pink. Apologies, I forget who makes this pink. I think it's a Pro-Acryl, but I don't remember. But any bright pink will do, and we'll use this bright pink to just give that meat and gore in his bag a little pop of an even brighter highlight. And then finally, to top it off, we're going to grab another Citadel shade color. Don't forget about these just because contrast is out. We're going to put a little bit of purple on his lips and in his eye sockets just to tint those a little bit more. Finally, to finish things off, we're going to give Hrothgorn an all-over coat of the Vallejo Mecha Matte Varnish. This is my strong recommendation for a matte varnish. It's durable, it looks great, and just kind of pulls all the colors together and eliminates any of that satiny shine you can get from contrast paints. And then grab a little bit of a gloss varnish and a couple of areas on this miniature that I think we'll do with a coat of gloss varnish. That's all the fresh catch in his bag. A little bit of gloss on the bottom will help tell the story of the blood soaking through. And then we'll also, on most miniatures, I usually grab a little bit of gloss varnish and give a slight touch of gloss varnish in the model's mouth and around their eyes. And that kind of gives the eyes just a little bit of a naturalistic, wet look. And there you go. We've gone from a blue and white undercoat, much like this one, up to this, I think, pretty good looking model, and about 45 minutes of painting time. That's not too bad. Here's stages, what I think of as 1, 2, and the final third stage. Tell me what you think of these in the comments below. If this inspires you to paint up some miniatures in this style, I'd love to see the results. If there's any miniatures you'd like to see done up in this style, let me know down in the comments, or if you have any questions. And of course, many thanks for liking the video, for subscribing. It really does help other people to find the show. And when it comes to this hobby, the more the merrier. The more people watching the video, the more questions we get, the more questions we can answer, and the more that we can help you get your miniatures painted up and ready for the table. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time for another Jolly Lark.